am your host, John Keene. As always, I would like to thank you guys for joining me. Ask that you please add, follow, and check us out. Instagram, Facebook, Best Damn Podcast, Twitter, The Real Best Damn, and wherever you watch us from, make sure to hit the like, give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, let me know what you think, and don't forget to share the link. It does help new people to find me. So I guess tonight we're going to be talking about the invisible shackles of the occult. Now, the reason I call them the invisible shackles, is because most people aren't aware that they are being bound by these. We got a large population where, it's become trendy to be woke or spiritual or, claim to have this awareness, which, they say in the Bible, pride goeth before destruction, meaning, it's our pride, it's human pride that usually leads to our own demise. And I feel like what was once true in the past is now true today. The same things that were true in the ancient world are still true, in this moment in history and in time. Now, I don't know how many of you guys, study different texts and things like that, but the powers that be, those that run the world, are in fact occultists. It's like we think it's trendy, and we see it trending in our algorithms on how all of these secret societies run the world, but we are being held ransom to a mystical power, a spiritual power. See, everything in our physical world comes from the spiritual world first, right? It's our spirit, and this is why, our purpose, as all animals on the earth stay in balance with nature, right? They all serve their own purpose. Fish swim, right? Reptiles do what they do. Everything stays within purpose, within balance, within creation, And humans being made in the image of God, our purpose, our place of balance is the spiritual world. That's why we're designed the way that we're designed, right? We're actually made in such a way that we can tap in to multiple dimensions and multiple facets of reality simultaneously, all at the same time, right? I believe it's called the electrochemical antenna that we all have. Our electrochemical antenna allows us to perceive multiple realities, multiple facets, multiple dimensions. And because of that, we're subject to the different powers that are in those realms and those dimensions, right? So we can, things that we can't exactly perceive can have a drastic effect on our life, And when we live in such a world or a reality where, the people that are in control, and you can just check this through history, right? Going back to the Third Reich and the Nazis and all of that, right? They were studying, different ways, different facets to be able to crack into the mind, into the subconscious, right? And through the subconscious, through the mind, and this is how the Hermetic principles are actually, thought of and believed to be, that the mind is the medium, right? It is what shares in both the physical. It partakes in the physical as well as the spiritual reality all at once. So the mind is like the window into both worlds, right? It's the channel into both realities, both dimensions of space, right? So through the mind, through mind control, through the alteration of the mind, is how they're able to get us to one, alter our own state of being, two, alter our own reality and the state of being of those around us, and are able to make us essentially slaves to the invisible realm, right? And you got to think too, now, a lot of these people, when it comes to these ancient bloodlines, and the reason they have these crests and, these lines that go all the way back to the monarchs that fucking ruled forever ago. The reason that they claim these bloodlines and these family names and all of this, like the Rothschilds, which are the red shields and goes to Saturn and all of that, right? The worship of the black cube and the cube of Saturn. The reason that they have these names and the reason that they claim these bloodlines is because they claim to be descendants of the fallen, right? The fallen angels. Now, if you look into the book of Enoch, I know it's not in the original canon of the Bible, right? They have taken it out unless you're like looking at the Ethiopian Bible, right? Or apocryphal text, depending on what religion you are or what denomination, which is a whole nother thing. We allow ourselves to be divided amongst our beliefs, but depending on what denomination you are, you may or may not be permitted to read that, but I'm sure a lot of you guys have anyways. But if you look into the book of Enoch, Enoch was taken up into heaven and he was asking for forgiveness on behalf of the watchers. And if you remember what God's response was, right? And this kind of gives you a little bit of insight into why someone might sell their soul. Someone that's, a part of those rich and powerful families. Why someone that is part of those rich and powerful families is the way that they are, right? Believes the way that they believe. Thinks the way that they think. Hold on, let me get this kicking off. That way I don't keep doing it on my phone here. There we go. Is because when Enoch asked for forgiveness on behalf of the watchers, right? On behalf of these fallen angels. Remember, God's response was, you shall have no peace. You shall have no forgiveness forever, and for the rest of your days. And not only did he not say that, right? He wasn't giving them forgiveness. He said your sons too, right? Your descendants, your children, these children are the watchers. They shall have no peace, right? They should be made to murder each other, to kill each other, etc., right? So you got to understand, these people are claiming to be descendants of these very fallen. The very fallen who had the light removed from their face, right? The very fallen who some were so fucking bad and so terrible, but that they actually chained them up into a prison, underneath the earth until judgment day. The very fallen whose sons, which were the giants, right? These watchers, that their spirits, because they weren't judged during these days for what they were doing to mankind when they were devouring us and drinking our blood and doing all the same things that they're doing to us still to this day. They went without judgment. God said that he would allow them to continue to do those things and go without judgment and walk the earth and then become the evil spirits of the earth, right? So you got to understand that this is who they descend from, right? So, for one, if it's true, and a lot of people believe it is, if we're dealing with people that's got some sort of like reptilian bloodline, right? People that are descendants of the literal fallen, the literal watchers, right? That they, in fact, they know that there's no forgiveness for them, right? If you're not all the way human and you're one of these, right? That means you're a watcher. That means you descend from the fallen. That means there's no forgiveness for you either. And I know that sounds like outlandish or probably crazy to some people, especially, those that believe we can all be forgiven through Christ and things like that. But I'm talking about, these wouldn't be, normal Adam. This wouldn't be, human beings like you and me, right? That's the whole reason of these bloodlines. They believe that they have this angelic DNA, that they have this angelic blood that runs through them, this blue blood, which is a copper-based blood, which is a conduit for electricity, right? Which allows them to be so powerful and magnetic with their powers that runs through them, right? So you got to understand that there's no forgiveness based on that. They believe that their descendants are part of that. So you have that for one, right? And then you look at, what is basically being worshipped or being used or utilized through deistic worship as well, right? And, there are different versions of Satanism, right? And Luciferianism, you have the deistic Satanism, and then you have, the non, which is believing you are your own God, right? And that's one version of Satanism. And I'm sure You know, and a lot of people wouldn't consider themselves this, but a lot of people that are practicing the New Age are, in fact, you know, practicing Satanism. You know, like that worship, considering yourself to be a god, right? So, just saying, you know, you are practicing a form of Satanism if you believe yourself to be a god, or be your own god, or be God. To take the title for yourself in any way, shape, form, or facet is to do, in fact, what Satan did, right? Which was, you know, take the throne of heaven for himself. You know, he elevated himself above God, right? And then you have deistic Satanism, which is to actually worship the deity of Satan, right? And if we're worshiping the deity of Satan, right, it's like recognizing that he is the God of this world, and that for, you know, all of these things that they desire, you know, all of these things that they seek, they got to go through that middleman in order to obtain them, right? They got to go through that middleman in order to obtain them. And so in order for them to achieve that, nothing is given for free, right? Everything, and this, you know, this is E equals MC square, right? Energy, you know, everything, energy has to be, it can never be created nor destroyed, right? So this works on the same principle even when you're dealing in the spiritual realm. You know, you can't get anything without giving something in return. You know, that's why whenever, you know, say you're practicing different forms of magic and witchcraft, you know, there's always some sort of offering, you know, to the deities. There's always some sort of offering to the spirits, because that is the exchange of energy, whether it's you, and depending on the spirit. You got to understand the reason that when it comes to a lot of these rituals, and you'll, you know, see people that claim to be Wiccan and shit like this, and they think that because they're Wiccan, they're not bundled into those that are practicing witchcraft. But actually, yes, you are. Most definitely, you are. Because I see a lot of people, you know, online in different groups and shit like that, and they'll be like, "Oh, well, I'm Wiccan. Wiccan isn't the same as witchcraft, and you know, it's through nature and blah blah blah." And it's like, well, actually, when, you know, Satan rebelled and enslaved all of us, the first people that he got was the elements. So, you know, all those elementals and shit that the Druids were worshiping, that's the reason they were worshiping them, because the elements was the first thing that he circumvented and hijacked whenever he enslaved us, right? So I'm just saying the elements are a major part of that, and just because you're Wiccan doesn't mean you're not practicing witchcraft. You're practicing witchcraft. You're just practicing an elemental form, right? And using nature, harnessing the elements, harnessing nature, right? Just because it doesn't seem dark doesn't mean it is, because we have to understand that behind everything is a spirit, right? Is a spirit that rules all of it. You know, even nature. So, you know, like I said, the mind being this kind of like mental, the mind is the mental battlefield, but it's like this medium place for both the spiritual and the physical world. It partakes in both of those realities. So that's where, you know, everything begins. That's why you see, you know, kind of like such an army of psychologists, right? You know, you look at like the different Jungian schools of thought and shit like that. You know, Carl Jung really broke it down really well. You know, when he was discussing how the archetypes, you know, these 12 main archetypes, which lo and behold, the 12 main archetypes, we have the 12, you know, astrological signs of the zodiacal wheel, right? So he was basically demonstrating that we create our own reality. Everything is, in fact, a projection that comes from within us, right? The mind, thought being the original creation, because we, in essence, are living in the thought of some God's mind, right? That God being God, right? Yahweh, right? Living in the dream or the thought of God's mind. Right? That's why when you look at the principles of hermetics, it's like, you know, the universe is mental, the all is mind. You know, we are, in fact, made in the image of God, or a reflection of God. So everything about us Because, like I said at the beginning, how animals are in balance with everything within their surroundings, right? Fish flow naturally in the water, so on and so forth. Humans, our natural element, our natural state is with God and in the spirit, right? So everything of the spirit flows through us naturally. Even though that we're wearing these meat suits, these flesh suits, it is in opposition, to the spirit. But like I said, we're able to use our vessel, basically as that electrochemical antenna to harness, the spirit and bring it into the physical. That's what we are. We're like the Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon prism, and that spectrum of light goes through us and is separated and becomes that rainbow. And it works on both ways, right? So kind of like back to what I was saying about Enoch, right? So Enoch, you got to think the original fallen, those who taught mankind all of the different shit, right? That all the different curses, hexes to pain our eyes, right? Their children were cursed as well as they were cursed, right? To have the light removed from their faces, right? Meaning, they would never see the light of God. They can't even look up to heaven because of their shame, right? And then you have these elites that rule the world that are actually, or claim to be, descended of them, so they would fall under that same curse. And it kind of makes you think, like, when you look at, like, Old Testament God and why he was such a hard ass, it kind of makes you, like, be able to see, why now, right? Like, why was Old Testament God such a hard ass? It's like, well, if you really truly think about it, was he that ruthless? When he was having the Israelites slaughter people and, not leave a survivor or not take any of the gold or the spoils or anything like that. The reason was, look at the people that they were fighting, right? They were fighting the Canaanites and shit like that, right? These Canaanites are the same people that are sacrificing children to this very day, When you go to Bohemian Grove, and all the Moloch worship, the Baal worship, the cremation of care, all of this goes all the way back to then, right? It goes all the way back to then. I've talked about this, in the past, and I'll get into it, more, in another video, that way I can kind of do it justice. But talking about the dog star and all of this, that's what the Canaanite, Anubis, all the dog stuff, the canine teeth, which are the sharp fangs that turned us into meat eaters when we evolved. And I use my quote fingers because I don't believe we naturally just evolved. I believe it was a genetic alteration. But when we evolved from Neanderthal to Cro-Magnus, and we went from having flat teeth to having fangs, right? It's because we got canines, we got the canines, and all of that comes from the Canaanites, and these Canaanites were in fact sacrificing children. So it's like, think of Old Testament God, why he's such a hard ass, why he was bombing on people the way he was back in the Old Testament. And it's like, yeah, it really starts to make sense, why he would want to wipe out everyone and leave no survivors. And notice, just like I said, right, everything has a cost, right? Everything has a cost. Anytime that they let those tribes, these evil tribes, survive in the Bible, if they didn't take them out like God told them, guess what happened? They ended up dying later on because there was a cost that had to be paid. There's always an exchange, right? E equals MC squared, right? Energy is never created or destroyed. It just simply, transforms into another, something else. Same thing in witchcraft, right? Same exact thing in witchcraft, right? Whenever you're asking for something from the spirit, and you're making a petition, whether that's to, Satan or Lucifer himself, or you're doing it to a demon, right? You can't get that for free. And that's why, a lot of things that cost a lot, like say you want to become famous or, something like of that nature, something drastic, you're asking for your destiny to be changed is essentially what you're asking, because that ain't what you was destined for, If you were destined for it, you wouldn't have to make a deal with the devil to get it. You see what I'm saying? If you were destined for it, it would come naturally. That would be the path of least resistance, right? That would be your magnetic groove that you had curved out for your life, and just by your hard work alone, that would come to fruition. That would be your destiny, your purpose, your mission, But if you're trying to alter the course of destiny, because we have free will, right? And this is why when people say, why doesn't God, why doesn't God stop this atrocity or that atrocity, or why doesn't God take out this person or that person? Why does he allow murder to happen? It's because it's free will, dude. It's like you can't have freedom if you're not allowed to do fucked up shit. You know what I mean? That's not freedom. He's trying to give you freedom to choose him, right? So, that's in essence what it is. It's like, okay, because think about it. If you really love somebody, you choose them naturally. You don't have to be forced to choose them at all. Think about it. And I think a lot of people have fallen prey to this, I have. Shit, but I'm sure more than just me. People have fallen prey to this in their life, especially when they're young, like trying to make somebody love you. You can't make nobody love you. You can't make nobody stay in your life that doesn't want to be in your life. You can't make nobody stick around that doesn't want to stick around. You can't make nobody be faithful that doesn't want to be faithful, and so on and so forth, right? So, in essence, if somebody truly loves you or someone, it's the same with God. It's like if we truly love God, then we will choose that, on our own natural accord. We'll choose that because that's what we want for our life. Not because we're forced to, because we're mindless automaton slaves that, have no choice in the matter. But that is what the enemy wants to create. That's the whole essence of the hive mind, because the enemy knows that you're not gonna love the enemy based on the enemy's works and what the enemy can do for you, right? So there's going to be none of that with the enemy, because the only thing it comes to do is to kill, steal, and destroy, right? Comes to kill, steal, and destroy. And you got to think too, these same watchers, right? Which, kind of looking at the term of the watcher, it is the heavenly host or the luminaries, right? So these watchers, and luminary basically just means a star, right? Heavenly host means a star, which don't get me started on all of that, because, when you hear of God and he's called the Lord of hosts, right? He's the Lord of hosts, which means he's the God of the stars, right? And he stands with his foot on the vault of the universe. So meaning he's outside of the space that we exist in, and he's outside of the heavens as well, right? Some people think he's Polaris. I do not think that he's Polaris. I think that's some Freemasonic nonsense, right? But some people believe that that's the eye of providence, which is the North Star, and that's God's all-seeing eye, right? But like I said, I think that's just Freemasonic occult garbage. But even some Christians believe that, because when you look at the firmament, right, Polaris is that fixed point, right? And I can't do it really without a diagram, but, with the compass and all of that, right, the square and compass of the Freemasonic, it comes from Polaris. It's the eye of providence, right? The all-seeing eye. But we have what are called the wandering stars, right? And the wandering stars are the planets, and if you look at the base word of planets, I think it's really interesting because it's plain, right? It's plain. So to me, and you look at what our planet is to us, right? We have the planet Earth, right? Which Earth derives from a few different things. It is an anagram for heart, right? Heart. And the Bible talks about how, wisdom actually comes from the heart, right? It's like it's not your mind, you know. True wisdom comes through the heart. That's where discernment comes from, is through our hearts, right? But it's an anagram for heart, and it also has, the name of Ea, which is the Lord of the Water, in Akkadian, I believe, and Sumerian Enki, Lord of the Earth, right? And that's the one who allegedly created us. In some translations, you can take Enki, which is the number 40 as well, and see the prominence of the number 40 with the 40 days in the desert, the 40 years in the desert, with Christ and with Moses and with all of that. But that is his Sumerian number, as a number 40. They all had numbers that were associated with their name. And I'm going to tell you how that kind of, where that all comes from here in just a second. But they all had numbers that associated with their names and stars and celestial bodies, right? These gods, okay? So these energies, and this is how, witchcraft and the occult works, right? Is the harnessing of this. I believe it's Agrippa, I believe, that said the occult happens with, it's mathematics, right? Meaning numbers, right? Like, and these are the numbers, these are the numerical codes, right? And that's why they say math is a universal language. Everything through numbers can be explained, right? Because we essentially live in a matrix, and everything is made up of these different algorithms and equations. Like I said, E equals MC squared literally explains witchcraft. Right? Energy to mass. It literally explains it. It's like, if you want to create one thing, it has to come from another. You don't get it without, putting something in first, and that's it's like the universe operates in a capitalist system. For sure. We're capitalists here in the universe. But and then you have the mental plane. The mental plane, which is thought, and the physical plane. Like I said, the mental plane partakes in both, right? It's partaking in the spiritual plane as well as the physical. It is it's the channel, right? It's our hard drive that allows us to participate within the simulation or within the matrix, and they have shown maps, and this is what's wild, man. They've shown maps that actually show that our brains themselves are maps of the universe, right? Like, so whenever you see that picture of the universe where, kind of like looks like it's all sprawled out like a web and shit, and they're like saying like this is the universal node or the universal organism, right? That's in essence what your brain looks like as well. It's pretty crazy, but everything is an image. And when I was talking about the Jungian philosophies and all of that, that's it, if you look at that in context, that's what that's saying as well. It's saying that we create our own reality. Everything is a mirrored image or a projection or a reflection, because we are the image of God. So we're a mirror image of the Spirit, made in the image of the Elohim, right? And I've said this ad nauseum, but I'll say it again, and which means a phantom, a projection, or an illusion. So we are simply a specter. We're a reflection of something at a higher dimensional plane, right? We're a reflection of the Spirit. We're a shadow, right? We're a shadow. And that's why, and you can see this too. You look at and that's why everything, in 4D, 5D, everything in the conscious existence or in the heavens has such a 360 view of things, right? Like, just, you kind of look at it like, if you're looking at on a 2D piece of paper, right? Say you write a stick man on a 2D piece of paper, okay? And you try to explain, the 3D to the stick man on the 2D piece of paper, right? He can't understand 3 dimensions because his world is only 2, right? So what's he going to do? You tell him, hey, I created you, right? I drew you. I made you, But because you're in, extra dimensions of space that he doesn't even have, he can't even perceive or fathom, what's he going to do? He's going to draw a picture of you on the 2D and worship that. And that's essentially what we do with God, right? Because we're in the 3D, we have access to the 4D, but God is beyond all of that. So it's like we're the stick man, We can't understand what God's like, so we've drawn a picture of him down here and we're worshiping that instead, right? But it's so much further than that, so much beyond, anything we can fathom, with our 3D selves, right? We can't even begin to imagine, what all of those extra dimensional perceptions would even be like, because we're in such a limited space, right? In such a limited place, and it's nothing against us, but it's like, that's why it says no one's ever looked on the face of God and lived, and all of that. It's because in this physical body, we're just way too restricted to actually, experience it fully, to know it, and to even understand it. And that's why the only way you can really begin to even tap in to that dimension and that realm at all is when you cut off all the senses, right? You ever heard of like sensory deprivation, or when you do meditation, you're closing your eyes, right? You're taking yourself out of the physical limitations, right? And tapping into that infinite space that's within you. That's why the kingdom of heaven is within, right? Because it's that nothingness that's within each and every one of us. You look at the essence of everything, like Satan, Saturn is the cube god, and that is the god of this world, right? And what the cube does, it's made up of angles, and and everything within our existence is based on that cube too. If you truly think about it. We live in a house that's a box. We go to school, that's a box, right? Like everything, within our life is a box. We create all these different labels and divisions, right? From our race, our sex, our age, our gender, right? Our everything it's boxed off, right? We're divided and separated, right? And each one of those, and you look into you look into a room, when you flip off the light or flip on the light in a room, you ever notice the last place that the light hits is in the corner of the room, and where it's darkness, because those angles are what traps energy, right? It traps energy. And that's in essence what we're living in, is an energy trap. Is an energy trap. And within this energy trap, this mirrored reality, where everything that we experience is something that comes from the consciousness into the mind and then expressed into the physical reality. And everything that exists within the reality is a image reflection of the collective unconscious, right? And that's, the whole Carl Jung stuff, right? Like I was saying earlier, how the 12 main archetypes and then the 12 signs of the zodiac. And then notice, Christ had the 12 disciples. There's 12 hours in the day, right? And then you go into other numbers, right? And like I was saying, everything's mathematics, right? Mathematics, spiritual, physical. These are the different realms, right? Then you have the 7 days of the week, the 7 colors of the rainbow, right? The 7 main planets. And notice that these 7 main planets are known as the wandering stars, right? So these planets, and this is pretty interesting to me, especially like when we, in the book of Enoch, to me, I can really see why it would be removed from the original canon and all of that, because how powerful it is in the information that it has. When you think of like Christianity, I'm not knocking Christianity at all. It's powerful and it's got some beautiful stuff to it as well. The Bible's awesome, and I can see why they would take the book of Enoch out, because some of it is kind of iffy. especially Enoch 2 and 3. I don't even think those are written by the same person at all. But he talks about these 7 mountains, right? And he calls them different names a bunch of times, right? He says like these 7 angels, these 7 mountains, these 7 burning mountains, right? And he's talking about them being in space, and these are the 7 main planets that were, and how these 7 angels transgressed against the Creator. These are the watchers. And notice how and I said, God being the Lord of hosts, and then you have the heavenly host, which are the luminaries. They are the stars, and the stars do what? Right? They're up, in the firmament. They're not down here with us. They're not in the soul system with us, right? They're up, past the firmament. They're the luminaries, meaning that, they haven't fallen. They're in the place they're supposed to be. But when Enoch talks about these 7 angels or these 7 burning mountains or these 7 stars or whatever, he says that they transgressed against the Creator, right? And I've got it written down how exactly he said it, but hold on. And these are the ones that he said, none of their requests shall be granted. Remember, none of their requests shall be granted. And that they would be bound for 70 generations or 10,000 years. And this kind of like takes you into the different cycles and stuff like that, which we'll kind of get into. But, there's many people that believe in these cycles, right? Like, you look at like Eastern mysticism, Hindus, Vedic texts, all of this, and yugas and all of that. Where, and many other different schools of thought as well, right? Catastrophism and all of that. The work of Immanuel Velikovsky, which I've covered a lot. The 3,600 years, 7,500 years, 12,500 years, 24,000 years, right? These long cycles, right? Of destruction and creation, right? Hold on. Sorry, I'm trying to do this with one hand. Right. So, yeah, 7 stars, like 7 great burning mountains. They'll be thrown into the prison. There's a prison for these stars, right? That didn't come forth when they were called at their time, right? And then think about the 7 main planets, right? And what the name of planet actually means, right? It means a wandering star, right? So these 7 burning mountains, or these 7 angels, or these 7, these 7 spirits, right? And it says it in about 3 or 4 different ways. He talks about these angels, right? And the ones who transgressed against God, and the ones who mated with women, right? That they didn't come forth at their appointed time. And then think about what the name of a planet actually even means. And why would they be any different, right? You don't hear, even though modern day astronomy and shit like that, calls them planets and calls everything else stars, right? And even though modern day astronomy and stuff says, yeah, there's planets and other star systems, right? But as far as the Bible is concerned, there's these wandering stars, and then there's the heavenly host, right? They're the same type of thing according to the Bible, and I feel like that's pretty interesting, considering like basically everything else that was put into the Bible is it eventually becomes proven as truth. In fact, some people would probably disagree, but I challenge you to show me a place where it's not been yet. But these are called wandering stars, right? Meaning like they are, they're not on their path, right? They're not doing what they were made to do, right? They're transgressing against the Creator, right? And that these are the ones, and that they'll be bound up in prison. And here's another interesting thing too that it talks about in the book of Enoch. That it talks about to the west, I believe. Hold on. Yeah, and see, these are also the angels who were with women and who took many forms. So then you think about all of the polytheism, right? In the antediluvian world and all of that, right? This whole, thing of polytheism and all of these different gods, and how all of them correlate. And like I said, the 7 days of the week, right? 7 colors of the rainbow, which, gets into, and I don't really have time to explain all of it, but, like the Gnostic system where the Gnostics were right, in essence, in their own way. When they talk about the demiurge, and that we're basically everything in the physical is made through this demiurge, right? And that God, in essence, is the ineffable or inexpressible one, right? Meaning that everything in existence, you can't call him good because good came from him, right? You can't call him the light because the light came from him. There isn't a word, a phrase, anything that, just like the 2D guy on the piece of paper, right? To the human, that's how we are to God, right? There's nothing we can express or think of or conceive of or describe that can describe God, right? According to the Gnostics, he's the ineffable, inexpressible one, right? And that the demiurge, which is, this evil amalgamation, right? That has trapped us in flesh, right? It starts to make a lot of sense because it's called, and I've talked about this before too, it's called soul luminescence or star in a jar, the premise of soul luminescence. That's what we are, within the firmament. It's soul luminescence. It's these 7 wandering stars, and every star has its own frequency, its own emission of energy, its own vibration, right? And this is where the whole concept of astrology and shit comes into, right? And the best way I can describe, that is like, just like we see the ages change through the precession of the equinox, right? And the precession of the equinox is whatever zodiacal sign, right, that the sun appears to be in from our vantage point at Earth. So it's amplifying that energy, for that 2,600 year period or whatever, at all of us. That's why 2012 was the beginning of that transition according to the the Mayan Baktuns and all of that, meaning the end of the Piscean age, the end of the age of water, right? And remember, when the Piscean age began, they had a deluge on the earth, a great flood, right? A great flood whenever this age of water began, and now we go into the age of Aquarius. And this may be too woo-woo for some of you, but trust me, it does make sense when you truly think about it. This, and because Christ even talks about the age of Aquarius, that, his disciples asked him, like, when will we know when the end of the age is here? When that time is here. It says, when you see the man carrying the pail of water, follow him into his house, right? That's Aquarius. That's the man carrying the pail of water. And, that's really symbolic too, considering Christ walks on water during the age of Pisces, right? All the rest of us, the rest of the world was drowned in the flood. The rest of us was drowned in the flood. In the occult and in the esoteric, water most of the time, in the tarot and stuff like that, means our emotions. So you can look at that a few different ways. Meaning like, during that period or during that age of time, mankind was overcome by our emotion or our physical state. It can also represent the physical as well, right? So it's meaning like this dip in consciousness where we were overcome, by our emotions and overcome by the world, but Christ was not, Christ being the Christos or the anointing, right? Which, if you look at it from a metaphysical point of view, that's that sacred secretion from the pineal gland of, the Kundalini activation and all of that, right? Which, I won't get too much into that, but that being that electrochemical antenna within us, the third temple, first temple, second temple, third temple, right? That third temple within us, because the eyes are the windows to the soul. That's why in the ancient days, when you looked in Medusa's eyes, you turned to stone. Giants, you had to cut their heads off and could still use it as a weapon because their eyes would turn you to stone, right? That's why when people talk about being abducted by extraterrestrials, they say that, once they look into their eyes, right? Like, Barney Hill, he couldn't take his eyes off of, the being in the ship. And a lot of people know who the leader is and all that just by the eyes, right? The eyes are the windows to the soul. And that's why, our tell a vision, right? Which is where a lot of the magic happens within our homes. And we are programmed through the programs, through the channels, that are telling us a vision or a lie from Hollywood, right? The wood of the holly tree, which is for witchcraft as well. But through that, we're watching it. So we're absorbing all of it. And I've said this in the past, symbols. A symbol is a representation of an energetic archetype or an energetic frequency. When like the pictographs and shit like that from ancient Egypt, the reason that they were so much more powerful than the characters, which think about it, it's called a character, right? Or letters and stuff that we have in modern day. The reason that they were so more powerful is because they were symbols, right? They were magnetic frequencies. So it's like when you looked on that symbol, right? The unconscious of your mind, through the eyes, through the windows of the soul, connected to that symbol, and that symbol would embody an entire energetic frequency, and it still does to this day. Think about the all-seeing eye. There's a prime example. The eye of providence or whatever. Or many other symbols. The symbol for pedophilia. All of these different symbols. When we look upon a symbol, it embodies an entire concept, an entire idea, as where words, characters, words, things like that, right? That is the division of an idea. It's it's a piece of an idea. That's where a word or an alphabet comes from. It's like we get a partial idea. We don't get the entire concept like we do through a symbol. So when we're watching these symbols on television, all this hidden symbolism, it's we're energetically connecting to that, whether we're aware of what we're seeing or not. You don't have to know the meaning of something for your brain to be able to make that connection and it to send those frequencies, to the subconscious. You don't have to know what the hell is going on at all, and that's why it's so dangerous, and that's why it's so powerful. Same thing like I was talking about with the whole, the Jungian concepts, like the ancients, and I know that this is where a lot of it came from, to me, and it says this in the Bible. It says that there's nothing new under the sun, nothing new under the sun. That's why it's like meaningless. Everything is meaningless, and that there's nothing new under the sun. Everything's already been done. It's already been discovered. And I feel like that's probably a huge reason why God was so pissed at these fallen, because when they come down here and they taught us all of these things, that's what they taught us, I think. They taught us, the inner workings of the psyche, and how symbols and all of these things, are trigger mechanisms, that can allow us to control and destroy and, and create and do all these different things, just through the mind alone, and Carl Jung's concept of everything being this reflection of the collective unconscious, from the stars telling the story of the heavens, right? Meaning the story of God, the story of Christ is literally written in the stars, and that's why God says, don't worship the stars. You're worshiping what is created, but yet it never stopped people from actually doing just that. The ancients, if you look at all the different accounts from like the Sumerians, and a lot of people will say like, well, the Great Flood and all of this, this deluge, it all came from older books. And that would be correct, right? It did come from older epics and older tales. But here's the thing, and this is one thing that I feel like it was really hard for me when I first started studying and learning to kind of like put this together. But it's something now that I've learned to a lot better. I would fall for that. Back in the day, it was like, oh, well, it's older, so this must be the correct version because it's older, right? If something's 3,500 BC, then surely, that's the truth, as opposed to something that appears to be a remake, of, that book, right? So like when we're looking at like the Akkadian, Sumerian, Babylonian, Mesopotamian, all, even, Greek and shit like that. It's like, yeah, that's gotta be what's true, right? Because that's older than the Bible. But if you really truly think about it, what you're seeing is not something that's necessarily like the original version, or else there wouldn't be all of these different, there's similar accounts of the same thing all over the earth. So it doesn't mean just because the one that we found, which, appears to be the oldest, but just because what we, think of it appears to be, Jesus, they're about to fight. What appears to be the oldest, because of the date, or what date we think it is, or what it's been dated to, carbon dated by the so-called experts. You got to understand, it's like from the time and from the region that it came from. So like, just for instance, like Enuma Elish, Epic of Gilgamesh, all these that have these, stories of deluge and flood, and we're told, by, all the different fucking, YouTubers, basically. You don't see a whole lot of, professionals that expound the same things, but they'll be like, oh, well, this one is actually, it predates the Bible. And like I said, this used to be something that would deceive me. I'd be like, holy shit, this is 3,500 years before the Bible was written. So this must be the true version. But what it actually is you got to think about the place and the time that version of the story was in fact written. They were worshiping multiple gods, right, in their society. Matter of fact, not only that, and just to kind of take it a level deeper, probably in some of these cases, they were literally living with those gods, right? If you look and if you believe these ancient accounts and these ancient texts, right, they say that in these ages past that there were actually, man lived with the gods on earth in the physical, and I just read this book actually on the Anunnaki and Sumerians. I have to look it up on my Spotify, but I listened to the audio book. It was talking about this, and it was saying that you can literally see the transition from the Sumerians, right? And before Sumeria was Mesopotamia, but then after Sumeria was Acadia, that you can literally see the transition from the Sumerians, and they were stating that the gods were there on the earth with them, right? They were living side by side with the gods, gods were sleeping with women, right? They created, I believe it's 7 demigods. And then you think about the wandering stars, or the planets, or the 7 burning mountains in the book of Enoch, the 7 stars that transgressed against the Creator and didn't come forth when they were called at their appointed time, right? And it says that they created these 7 emissaries, right, to rule over the earth, right? And then you look at the Akkadian epics, and then all of a sudden, and remember, Acadia is very similar. It's like right to the south of Sumeria, but all of a sudden, as society evolves, something happened, and the gods go from living right here on the earth with man to being up in the sky, right? And then all of a sudden, you see the usurping of Marduk, right? You see Marduk has usurped everything, and this kind of makes you wonder, and I've talked about this before. I believe Marduk is where the modern age of enslavement actually began, right? Our enslavement to these entities. And I want to be careful because I don't know for a fact. And one thing I have learned, is like when it talks about be careful heaping abuse on heavenly beings. You better be careful heaping abuse on heavenly beings, because I've learned this lesson the hard way. I'll just say that. When people say that and I used to be a firm believer in this as well, that there's no danger in reading certain texts and certain books and shit like that, and I'll just tell you, like, from my own personal experience, I don't no longer believe that anymore. Because, like I said, the eyes are the windows to the soul, and a lot of these ancient texts and stuff, especially Sumerian texts in particular, in the Necronomicon also, those are which allegedly has ancient Sumerian in it as well, right? When it talks about Cthulhu and the old ones, that whose names shouldn't even be spoken, right? Because they're that evil, right? And everybody believes it all comes from the whole Lovecraftian era and all of that. I believe Lovecraft actually was just in mystery schools in a secret society and knew about this stuff and wrote about it, like a lot of Freemasons and, occultists, write about, C.S. Lewis and all of them. They all write about these things, which, even if they're not consciously doing it, they're still channeling those spirits because that's what they're into. Everything has a spirit behind it, and whatever you're into, that's what you're tapping into as your source. That's, we can't help it. We're mediums. All of us, we're channels, all of us, electrochemical, antennas, and whatever, dial we're tuned to receive is based on, where we're directing our thoughts, where we're directing our attention, our focus, our energy. Where attention flows, energy goes, right? And remember, these gods, they needed us because, which just goes to show you that, they weren't actually, gods to begin with. This is where the whole tale of vampires and all this comes from, right? Which, once again, think about it. King Charles to this day, lets people know that he's a descendant of, Vlad the Impaler, right? Which is, the original Dracula, in the living flesh, right? Dracul, which means son of the dragon, And like I said, all of these elites and their bloodlines go all the way back to that. All of their crest, all their bloodlines, all of it goes back to the fallen. And if you look into the book of Enoch, what does it say? Right? That the fallen and their children, their offspring, which if you're a descendant of that, or a descendant of Cain, right? They would be marked just like with Cain. And I'm going to get into something in just a second. This is, Enoch also talks about the moon and its purpose and everything, right? But you're a descendant of Cain. That means you have no forgiveness, dude. You have no forgiveness. There's literally, it talks about in the book of Enoch that there's on the moon, I believe it's describing the moon. I'm not going to say for a fact it is. But when it's describing those 7 burning mountains, those 7 angels who changed their form and transgressed against God because he didn't come forth at their appointed time, which are the planets, the wandering stars, which are the fallen, which are the archons, right? Who create those 7 prisms of light that go through the 7 rays of light, which those rays of light go through the prism that is the firmament and then separate. That creates the soul luminescence, which is the physical reality, right? Star in a jar, so that makes them literally when the Gnostics talked about the demiurge, right? But it also talks about this hollow rock, right? This hollow rock that's up here in space. So remember, he was taken up and he was shown all this stuff, right? While he was still alive, and he was told to write it all down because the end was coming at that time, remember, Noah or Zayasudra in the Sumerian epics, which, Zayasudra was spoken to from Enki through the reed wall, and he was warned against all of this. And remember, Enki in some translations means I am who I am. Just saying. And he's the one who created us according to those epics and those tales. He's the shepherd, the good brother, and he wasn't, and remember, he also wasn't chosen to be the king. That's another thing. His brother Enlil was the Lord Commander, who is the Lord Commander of the earth, right? Who would be Satan, because he's the one who also destroyed the earth with the flood and didn't like humanity and wanted us destroyed. So, you start putting these together. And remember also, too, I'm going to hit you with a couple other things. Remember how I said earlier how, the Sumerians all had numerical codes, or, they all had numbers in stars and names, right? Because everything was broken down into these different, realms, because it's multidimensional for these deities and these gods. The number of Enki was 40, right? The 40 years in the desert, 40 days in the desert, all this with Christ and Moses, right? And there's so many different similarities with, Moses and Christ, and even Joshua coming after Moses and Jesus' name being Joshua, right? There's so much stuff. I could make an entire video on that. Being raised up with the serpent, the body broken, the staff, all of it. I could just go on and on. But then you think about Enlil's number, and Enlil's number was 50, right? And remember, what did Prometheus, aka Lucifer, do? He stole the 50 sparks, right, from the gods and gave them to humanity. So you start to see, and that's why we have the 50 stars on the flag and stuff of the United States, and we have, Libertas or Hecate with the Liberty spikes, right? Which is also, it's Lucifer, right? That's why it's got the chain on the foot and all that, and it's a tranny, Lucifer holding up the flame of Prometheus, right? Which is Columbia and all of that, right? But you see it in the United States because, we are, and you think about all the founding fathers who were all about liberty and freedom and all these progressive ideas. They were all, in the mystery schools, right? Freemasons and Luciferian as well, which, Lucifer's the great architect, the great architect. So I'm just saying. And then the son of Enki, which would be, and just kind of hear me out on this. I'm not saying this is true. I'm just telling you the similarities, right? And this kind of gives you the idea of how the polytheist and stuff kind of translates into today as well. The son of Enki, the son of God, right, was Marduk, and he was the ram, okay? He was the ram. And back then was the age of Aries was beginning. So remember, from the Sumerians to the Akkadians, and the Sumerians, the gods were on the earth. We know that, Enoch and all these other epics, talk about how the gods once walked with man, right? When you look at the king's list and all of this, right? Like they were ruling for tens of thousands of years here on the earth. And then when they were getting ready to leave, they created these emissaries, these 7 emissaries, allegedly, right? Which would correlate to those wandering stars, those planets, the demiurge, right? And that beginning, and then a new age began, which would be the age of Aries or the age of the ram. And then all of a sudden, Enki's son, right? His firstborn son, whose name was Marduk, or Marduk, as some people call him. But Marduk, who was the ram, there was a celestial sign that basically marked his ascension. And I believe that celestial sign was the precession of the equinox. The heavens were like showing, like it's the age of the ram, so it's the time for the ascension of Marduk. And then all of a sudden, Marduk ascended, and he took the rank of 50, right, which was Enlil, So, he became God in essence, right? He became the Lord Commander, of the earth. And then you look at how the Akkadians, which were right after the Sumerians, said that the gods were no longer, here on earth with us. They were up into the heavens. And then now take it all the way back, right? Then when we're looking at these other texts and these other books, right? Like the Epic of Gilgamesh, like the Enuma Elish, like Enki's World Order, and we're looking at this, and you're like, look, you got to look at it like, yeah, it's written, 3,500 years before the Bible, but this was literally the days of and right after, when these gods were on the earth with men, So, and remember, why did God get so pissed? Because they transgressed against mankind. They came down here and they taught us all this stuff, which made us incredibly wicked, and were getting us to worship them. They were getting us to worship them, and I said this at the very beginning, like real, true love, and if you guys could, if you're watching this, please hit the thumbs up for me. I see like only a couple of thumbs ups if you're watching this live. But remember, like, real, true love, is free will. It's a choice, right? So God giving all of his creatures free will. This is why, when people ask, like, why would Satan be able to, even challenge God or anything like that? Well, it's because he allowed him to, He's like, well, even the angels, all of his creations have free will because, even though he's all knowing and, omnipresent and all these things, right? Which and I think this really does kind of demonstrate the love too, on a whole nother level when you think about it. He doesn't need any of us, right? But he put himself in this position to need us. You know what I mean? Like, basically by allowing us to choose him and choose love, it's like this, we can also reject him, And if you look at, like, in the book of Hosea, I believe it is, God basically describes, when we don't choose him and when we don't love him, that it's akin to like adultery, right? It's akin, to, like your wife going out and cheating on you, It's akin to that. It's like it literally feels the same to God because that's literally what we're doing. We're committing spiritual fornication. We are in union with other spirits, right? When we are when we're going against, his commands, and when we're going against, and the Bible literally gives us, and it's like, people think, well, it kind of sucks to have this, this rule book, right? Like we're given this rule. God drops this, 66 books of rules on us, like boom, here's this thick ass book for you guys to follow, and it's like because everything, that's internal, like, that's why you can see this, it's proven with the golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, right? The Vesica Pisces, all of this, right? This repeating pattern that's within all of creation. It's like, and when God says he's written his name on each and every one of us, right? That he has, literally. We have that golden ratio, that Fibonacci sequence. We have it written on everything. There's nothing that doesn't have it. So the equation, remember the mathematics, once again, right? The numbers, which is also the pattern, all of that, just to get into all that again, right? Is written on every single living being. And then you have these inherent laws, right? And rules. And, remember, these laws can't be transgressed. This is what holds the reality together, like the E equals MC square, right? That exchange of energy to mass, that transfer of energy, in exchange, that is a law of creation, right? It can't be usurped or avoided. And that's why we have these laws of karma, People can say karma is not real, but it most definitely is. You get back what you put out into the universe, and I can tell you for a fact that's true. It is. It's true. It may not come back all at once. It may not come back immediately. It may come back delayed. Because I believe too, God, because we are loved so much, a lot of times God knows that we don't even know the true impact of some of the shit we do, So I think he lessens our blow on the other side of things. That way we don't get the extreme blow when it comes back to us, because if we got every single thing that we deserved, a lot of us wouldn't be here today. A lot of us wouldn't be here today. And that's why we're allowed to do horrible things to other human beings. That's why all these atrocities happen in the world, because we have that free will the same way that those angels were allowed to transgress against humans and corrupt us and deceive us and, enslave us and do all the things that they've done to us. For a time, right? For a time, they got theirs as well. You think about it and think about the energetic exchange that they got, right? They eternally corrupted mankind, right? They corrupted us in an irreversible way. So what was their punishment, right? They were put into a prison, and it's irreversible. They can, because they knew. And he even calls them foolish and stuff, which is crazy. He's like, he's like, you foolish watchers, right? Like, you foolish angels. You didn't even know the fullness of my plan, And because of that, you went ahead and you transgressed against humans, and you taught them witchcraft and idolatry and all these terrible things, sexual immorality. You taught them all these terrible things, gave them weapons to murder, and because you did that, you will have no peace. You took peace and corrupted this entire species, and because of that, that will be, your reward on the other side. So, like, that's your biggest example of karma right there, And the reason we can even be forgiven is because, like I said in the, earlier, how you have the man and he draws the stick figure on the piece of paper. So the 2D stick figure can never understand the 3D man who drew him, right? He'll just try and draw, a man on the piece of paper and worship that, just like we do with God. We can never understand, the God that's outside of the 3D, because we're not we're not experiencing that, so we can't fathom it. And because of that, that's why we're allowed forgiveness, And I believe, and like I was saying about the moon, it talks about too in the book of Enoch, this hollow rock, basically. And it's and think about it too, how they say the moon is hollow. They hit it and it rung like a bell. And this is objects have hit it and it's ring like a bell, literally. And we know that it's not a natural object in space because the damn thing doesn't rotate, dude. The damn thing doesn't rotate. And not just that, there's more than that, but it's in a freaking tidal lock. Everything else in space is allegedly spinning. Everything else is supposed to be rotating and spinning, but our moon does not move. It's in a tidal lock, just facing us one side the entire time, And then you also have, them alleging that the damn thing's hollow. And then it's the precise place to like I don't know, an eighth of an inch or some shit. It's very, very accurate. The precise place to where it does perfect, in distance to do an eclipse and all of this. I mean, it's just, and it's too big for our planet. It couldn't have come from the Earth. I mean, there's just so many different things about the moon that basically says it's probably artificial. It's probably artificial. And then you wonder also, and I'm just going to hit you with a hypothetical. I know a lot of people that watch this channel do not believe that we ever landed on the moon. And I'm one of those people. I don't think we landed on it physically with boots on the ground type shit. I don't think we did. I don't know for a fact. Maybe we did and they didn't show us the footage because it was terrifying what they found there. I don't know. There are parts of that recording where, Neil Armstrong says some pretty weird things about, lights and stuff like that, has allegedly been cut out of all of that, and then it makes you wonder why they staged the entire thing in a studio and, all of that. It does make you wonder, if we actually went, why wouldn't they show us the real deal footage, and maybe why did we never go back? If so, maybe we got ran off. This is one possibility. And this could be why we only send probes and stuff like that now. Why we've never really seen the dark side of the moon or any of that. Maybe we got ran off. And when you look at the book of Enoch, like I said, it talks about this rock, right? That's hollow. And then it talks about basically that it is used to store all of the souls. It's used to store all the souls, so what he's describing in his vision when he goes into the heavens, first he's describing, the sun, and he talks about this river of fire that's literally pouring into the sun. And, this kind of gives us the concept. And this has been a belief of mine, at least. I believe the sun acts as like a portal, and it's pouring out, light and infinite awareness and all of that through the sun. It's plasma. I don't know. I'm not sure or certain on that, but that's just a thought I've had about it. And then it talks about these 7 burning mountains or 7 angels that change in various forms, right? That transgressed against God. And then it talks about this hollow rock, and then it's got these, I think it's 3 or 4 different chambers. Hold on, let me look at my notes here. So this hollow mountain of rock, which houses the spirits and the souls of the dead until judgment, right? And it's got these different chambers. I think it's 4. Hold on. It is the spirits of, sorry guys, spirits of the dead, the spirits of the righteous, the spirits of the sinners, and I believe it says it's the spirits of the sinners who don't repent, so they won't be resurrected. Basically, it's saying like Sheol. It's like it's got the spirits of the righteous, right? So like the spirits of the ones that are going to be resurrected, on the day of judgment and called up into heaven. And then it's got the spirits of the sinners that won't repent, but they're not bad enough for whatever reason to go to hell. I don't know why, but they're not, And but it says they won't be resurrected on Judgment Day. And then it's got the spirits of the ones that will go to hell, right? And speaking of hell, I'll tell you what I think it might be in just a second. Because I believe he talks about it. He does talk about it, but I'm going to tell you what I think it might be. But then he talks about the spirits of, those that are like, truly, truly evil, and the ones that are going to be bound with those watchers, right? Those fallen, they'll be bound with them. And then beyond, so, and you think about it too. And I've heard this, in other versions. And if you think about the Sephiroth, right, and Kabbalism and all of this, which he then goes on to describe the Kabbalah tree, by the way, right after this. He talks about Tamiel and Zedekiel and all these different angels that rule these different areas. And what he's talking about is the Kabbalah tree. Just saying. I mean, I don't have the book right in my hand. If I did, which I'll do like a screen share or whatever on the next video and show you what I'm talking about. Show you how he's literally describing the Kabbalah tree, right? But he's describing these different angels that rule these different spheres of, these celestial spheres or dimensions or energies of heaven and earth. And I've literally heard too, and think about the Kabbalah. It's like that, that silver sphere. It's at the bottom, the lunar sphere. Everything in witchcraft goes through the moon, basically, right? It represents carnality. It's like the channel from, the heavens into the earth, right? And it allegedly holds the spirits of the 7 deities as well, right? When you start thinking, and another name for the moon is Levin, right? Which means sin. Think about the concept of the Saturn moon matrix, right? Where, Saturn represents that soul system, right? The solar system, which is the soul system, the soul trap. And the moon acts as a parabolic dish, in essence, right? This hollow fucking object that acts like a satellite and is basically amplifying that Saturn frequency, right? Because remember, Saturn has the hexagonal North Pole, which is the hexagram. You think about the hex. This is the cube, and you think about the hex, which is the cube, and the cube is the box, right? And remember, these angles are what actually traps energy. So that's what traps the energy and traps light. And I gave you the example, earlier, whenever you flip on a light in a room, right? Where's the last place, to be lit up in the room? It's the corners of the room, right? Because it holds energy, it holds light, it holds darkness the best, right? That's why, like, you look at like all of the Tartarian buildings, which, I believe Tartaria was definitely the fallen angels. I don't believe it was us at all. There for a moment I thought it could be us, but I don't believe it was at all. Actually, and if you think of Tartary, think about what, that even derives from, right? Like, Tartarus, that's hell. That's hell. It's Tartarus and Dudael or whatever, from the Book of Enoch, probably the same place. I'd say so. So if you think about Tartarus and Tartary, and Tartarians and all of that. And once again, all the Tartarians had the same things that you see from the families, that claim to descend from the fallen today, right? They had those crests and all of that represented their family name and their lineage, like with the Merovingians who from France, who claimed to descend from the bloodline of Christ. The royal thing was bees, right? It was bees. It was supposed to protect them in the afterlife or some shit like that, right? So, in the Napoleonic dynasties that happened after that, you see Napoleon actually put bees and stuff on his shit, trying to, basically, I don't know if he was just trying to invoke that energy to pretend like he was like Christ, or he was claiming he was, by showing that representation, that symbolism, was trying to allude to him being descended from the same people, but I doubt it. But anyways, right? And then you look at like Tartarians, they had like the griffin and all of that, and it's like think about like all the eagles, eagle-headed and lion-headed or lion bodies and shit like that of the ancient texts and shit like that. Jupiter with the eagles and, all of that. And these were, the same deities and demigods. And this takes you into those 7 emissaries that were created in the, the Akkadian books, right? By the fallen. They created these 7 emissaries to rule as kings over the earth. And these 7 emissaries were fucked up. I'm just going to tell you. They were like, one of them was a flying serpent that invoked the spirit of fear. One drank the blood of humans. Like, none of them were good or nice. Not one. And they lost the 7th name, right? So one of them, they didn't know the name to it. But, they had the names of these 7, right? But these 7 emissaries, they were 60% God and 40% human, basically, is what they said, which, this lets you know they were doing some sort of, genetic mixing or whatever. So, but, like I said, in Tartaria, right, these Tartarian buildings, if you look at it, for one, they were using technology that's, honestly is beyond beyond what a lot of what we can do today. Like, if you look at like the stained glass in the cathedrals and buildings, that stained glass, if you use cymatics, right, to look at those patterns in the glass, they literally represent, and this is crazy as shit. This shows you how advanced they were. But the patterns, the stained glass in the windows, literally represents the same acoustic pattern or frequency or vibration of the building itself. So whatever the harmonic frequency of that building was, it was in a cymatic pattern in the stained glass window. Now tell me that isn't some advanced ass technology, dude. Like, you have to be so advanced to even understand that. We're just now able to begin to wrap our heads around that. And it's still kind of woo-woo pseudo science, right? Like, mainstream science hasn't fully even embraced all of this stuff yet, and then you look at the acoustics of the buildings and all of that, and how all of the archways were curved, right? Everything was curved and rounded. And like, think about like all the palaces of the Russian czars and all of this. It was all rounded, except for what they called weather vanes, right? Which weren't weather vanes at all. They were, these like copper antennas on top of the building that had these glass walls. And I'm trying to think of what the kind of glass it was. Uranium or something like that. Radium glass, I believe it is. But even in the 1800s, people were drinking out of radium because it was supposed to be having healing properties. And you ever see like the radioactive fallout symbol, right? Like, people had that in their stoves because they were using radium stoves and shit like that, right? because radium is supposed to burn, really well and all this. And they were making glasses and all kinds of stuff out of it, right? So they had these balls of glass that were on top of these copper veins or antennas, and inside of the glass they had mercury, and then when they would ring the bells, which, remember, the Nazis came through, and what did they do? They removed all of the bells in the towns that they conquered, which crazy. And then you think about Philadelphia and the Liberty Bell and how it has a crack in it, and how there's the same replica bell, in Moscow and other places in the world, and that this crack in the bell is a representation of something, right? So hear me out. These bells, they would literally send out a frequency or a vibration, still to this day, and this is why you don't ever really see bells anywhere, but bells send out a harmony, a frequency, a vibration, and people have used, cymatic plates and shit like that to show, frequency and harmonics in real time, and to show, what they're actually doing, and bells are in the same harmonic frequency as Christ, Jesus, right? Different words and word analogies, and but it's all good and biblical and positive and beautiful, right? So these bells are giving off these vibrations, right, which would charge the mercury inside of this radium glass, right, which had the copper, which, remember, the blue bloods, which is coming from copper, right? They believe they had more copper in their blood. These entities did. That's where you get the concept of the blue bloods at. Right? But the copper is a conduit of energy, of electricity, So that would basically, make the mercury spin and vibrate, which would then go all the way, and it'd be grounded into the actual ground and be run into the building, and light up their little oil and gas lamps and all types of shit throughout the entire place. They were even doing this with street lamps, with gas lamps and stuff, 1800s and stuff like that. They've taken out all of this, stuff, and and that's why you see too in a lot of like really, really old buildings, they will say, not built by, but they'll say founded, they'll say founded, like founded by so-and-so in 1822, and I believe the reason or the purpose for that actually being because, that wasn't when the buildings were actually built. It's when somebody came and just claimed the damn thing and said so we think the building's only 200 years old, but it's really probably like 2,000 years old, and that a lot of these buildings, what we call, and there's a whole community, of it online, talking about the Tartarians and stuff like that. I believe everything that we believe is Tartarian is probably, fallen angel technology. I don't think it was actually us, and if you look at like the whole concept of the Atlanteans and all of that, the Atlanteans, according to the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, he talks about how, the water, rose up over the earth. So this is like the time of the Great Flood, right? The deluge. And he says that they were, these beings, the Atlanteans, who were at this incredibly high level of civilization, right? But all of a sudden, the entire earth became evil and corrupt, just like it's talking about, in the book of Enoch and in the Bible and all of this, right? The world gets flooded. They hop in their spaceship and rise up into the sky, right? And then all of a sudden, the water covers the temple of light and all of this. And then they go and take out the plan, which they know of, right? So they made a plan. They conspired together, these Atlanteans did, to go throughout the earth to the different places. And remember, Thoth says that they took these emerald tablets, which gave them the authority of Thoth, to the Mayans, right? Because the Mayans remembered the most, right, out of these different cultures, and that the other Atlanteans went to other parts of the earth, you know, and I believe this was the age of Pisces, you know. So it's like, and then just to kind of take it a step further, right? Have you ever heard of the concept of, you know, the Romans with the Council of Nicaea, you know, and how back in that time, you know, when they made the switch to the Gregorian calendar and all of this, that, you know, the days were like I 900 or I 330 or I 650, right? And you can even kind of like, which I won't get into that, but they had the I before all of that, and that there was allegedly a pope that came along at a certain period of time that transformed the I, right, into a one, right, because he wanted to be, you know, in a particular year. I forget which year it was. It was like year 1000 or some shit like that, right? But he was like a pope or a king or something like that. But they were trying to like change the calendar to go according to their reign, which I doubt that's what the true reason was. I believe they were actually trying to confuse history. But either way, and we know that the popes and the Templars and the Jesuits and all these secret societies, you know, and these mystery schools, which, you know, we believe that the secrets that they're hiding, you know, is all of just this occult knowledge. And it is, right? But remember, occult just means hidden. So it's not just like, you know, these Canaanite rituals of sacrificing kiddos and shit like that, right? It's not just that. It's not these cultures of, you know, getting each other up the ass. It's not just that. It's you know, the secrets of history as well, you know, and it's the fact that they added 1,000 years to the calendar, you know, and a lot of people believe this. I'm not the only person who, you know, who believes that, you know, the I 900 and all that became 1900, and that, you know, they literally confused the time when they switched to the Gregorian calendar, you know. And they did this on behalf of kings and popes and monarchs, you know, which, if you think about, you know, each one, you know, think about it. For one, the Pope is supposed to be the vicar of Christ, right? I'm sorry to the Catholics that are watching. I'm not knocking your religion or anything. But that means he's Christ on earth, right? He's the office of Christ on the earth, you know, which is kind of heretical, you know, if you think about it. I'm not saying that, you know, your religion's wrong or anything like that. I believe, you know, it's like it's the oldest organized version of Christianity we have, right? So there's a lot of truth there, and, you know, they did absorb all of the polytheistic religions, right? Like, that's one of the things. They're the reason why Christianity is so huge on the earth today. You know, because instead of old religions and old civilizations, when they would conquer somebody, you know, they'd kill all the men, they'd rape all the women, they'd enslave all the children, and then they'd go burn down all the altars, all the temples, right? Burn it all to the ground, you know, but that's not what the Catholics did, you know, Christianity did. They're like, nah. It's like, take down their idols, right? Bless the altar, bless the church with holy water, and put up a cross, right? So it's like they were able to, you know, to recruit all these other people, you know, and then they even started incorporating, you know, different variations of the polytheistic stuff into the religions, you know. You think about like how Christmas and all of that, right? Like, you know, this is where all this stuff comes from, you know, because they incorporated paganism, you know, into their beliefs. They just mixed it up. And then think about, you know, Rome, how it transferred from a political power. You know, Constantine sees the symbol of the cross in the sky, which, you know, did he actually see the symbol of the cross? Because I want you to think about this, you know. Nibiru, right, which in the Enuma Elish is it's Marduk, or it's Jupiter, is what it actually is. It's Jupiter, according to the Enuma Nibiru. And it's also what Nibiru actually is in Babylonian. It's also Jupiter, right? I'm just going to break something down. So when we think about Nibiru, a lot of people think about the whole Zechariah Sitchin. You got to think about Zechariah Sitchin. He was a member of the synagogue of Satan. I don't think, the things that he said was extremely reliable. Matter of fact, after I just read this book I read, I think about 50% of what he said was horseshit, at least, maybe more. Because what he did was he took Sumerian tablets, which others have translated these things, and they've gotten not even half the shit that he got out of these things. I mean, this dude wrote a great book out of it and all this. Like, they did not get, if you've ever read these tablets yourself, they are so simple. They they repeat the same phrase. They'll be like, Enkidu was sent to kill Gilgamesh. So when Enkidu was sent to kill Gilgamesh, he prayed to Inanna. So when Enkidu was sent to kill Gilgamesh, he prayed to Inanna and he sat by a tree. When he was sat by a tree and prayed to Inanna, it's just super, super repetitive, So there's not like a lot of vocabulary and language within these texts. But, Zechariah Sitchin comes with this great-ass novel out of all of it. It's like, which I'm not saying it's all fake. I'm just saying it said that he also took Akkadian epics and mixed it. That's why you'll see in his book too, in Enki's World Order, right, where his translations within Enki's World Order, you'll see Enki has two names in that, and the reason being because, and I said this earlier, Ea is the Akkadian name, and then Enki is the Sumerian name. So it's like he's literally mixing both of the names, right? So he's mixing both of the names, and using them both, Enki and Ea. Those are from two different ages. And remember what I said earlier, too. The Sumerians literally said that the gods were here on earth with them, right? And then by the time the Akkadians come along, which all of a sudden is the ascension of Marduk. Marduk is a ram, which means the age of Aries had began, right? The gods are all of a sudden in the heavens, So you see all of these, these different things that are taking place, which kind of lets you know that, they were, maybe things were not as accurate as were being depicted, by Zechariah Sitchin, And, so, like I said, like in the Council of Nicaea, and what was it, like 16 something or whatever, right? So you had this, the Gregorian calendar, right, where they literally they went from the I-600, I-900, right, to 1600 to 1900, right? And they changed the calendars, changed the days and the times and all of this. And then you think about who these people actually were too. Not only the ones that changed the calendars, but the ones who decided what was the original canon of the Bible as well, right? These are the people that decided which texts went in, which ones went out in the Council of Nicaea, right? So you have all of these monarchs, these oligarchs, right? These monarchs, which the reason that they are monarchs is because they believe that they ruled by divine right, right? What gave them the divine right, you may ask? I'm sure you already know what gave them the divine right. The divine right actually came from their bloodline, right? That's why they allegedly killed the Merovingians, right? Because the Merovingians threatened the entire religion of Christianity if there was, in fact, a blood descendant of Christ, which I don't believe that happened, but some people do believe it, but either way, so all these bloodlines descend from the fallen. And like I said earlier, in the video, if you're a descendant of the fallen, that means you're under the curse of, of Cain, right? The mark of Cain. Like your ass is cursed, There's no forgiveness for you. You have the blood of the fallen running through your veins. Remember when Enoch went on behalf of the fallen and their children, the Nephilim, which still, this is kind of even goes to more proof that these children of the fallen were not all giants. They weren't all giants, I believe. I believe that was a period of time, but they survived past that because it literally talks about, like I said, in Emerald Tablets of Thoth, he's like, let's go and do this plan that we have, and all the hermetic, occulted, all this is about being sealed or hidden, and the plan, being to change the date and times, right? To confuse the languages, all of this, in this. And if you think about it, this means they've tried to create the New World Order, before as well. You think about the Tower of Babel. And when I looked at, and I'll just be honest, when I looked at a lot of these things through the scope of not having like a firm grasp and understanding of things, like it really did deceive the shit out of me. I won't lie. Like it really did. It's like when I looked at like the Tower of Babel, I thought, like, why would God, confuse the languages and divide all of us and, all of that, and then when you look at it, it's like, it wasn't actually us that was doing it. It's like, this is Nebuchadnezzar and, all those fucks, right? It's like, this was the fallen, and their offspring that were literally trying to create some type of contraption, probably a type of CERN or something like that, because we do see, at CERN, the Large Hadron Collider, which has, you think about it, CERN is giving place to the World Wide Web, right? The LHC, quantum computing, which is turned into fucking AI and D wave and all of this, and D is delta wave, which is the sleep wave. You got to think about all of, that's come out of this, from 5G to chemtrails to microplastics, this entire transhumanist system, was fallen angel technology meant to digitally enslave us. And it's like trying to create a reality within the reality, like trap our consciousness within a conscious trap. Like we're already in like this natural type of matrix or simulation that operates through the electrochemical antenna, that we have, our third eye, our spirit that, it interfaces within these realities. It's like we are already in somewhat this kind of trap, right? This net, if you will, and then it's like they are trying to create a synthetic or an artificial net within the net because this one is going to be destroyed. It's like they created this one and God said, okay, well, you trapped them in it, but because everyone has free will, all of my creation has free will. And you think about each time the earth has been destroyed too, it's like they've tinkered down the fallen a little each time. It's like at one point they were their fallen selves and they were, in this spiritual form and way more powerful. And they did so much messed up stuff that those fallen got put into prison, right? They got put into prison, which, what I was getting to, like, what I think is hell and all of that, right? The Tartarus and Dudael and all that. It talks about in the book of Enoch, to the west, I believe, talks about this place of fire or this burning, thing of fire, this burning rock or whatever. And you think about like what people have talked about with, Planet X or Nibiru or in the Bible or the Cobran Bible, which was written on brass and it was allegedly pre-flood, right? So, antediluvian world, right? Which would be the time when these watchers were on the earth as well. and it was called the Destroyer of Worlds, right? And you think about when Moses, who some believe was also Akhenaten, you know, went on Mount Sinai, right? Which sin, AI, very strange. When he was on Mount Sinai, you know, the fire and pillars of smoke and the burning bush, right, which was the presence of the Lord, right, or what he thought was the presence of the Lord, you know. And then you think about the Colburn Bible, and it talks about this destroyer of worlds, right, which is, you know, it's burning of smoke and sulfur, and it has this dark, ruddy red glow and all of this, and that it poisoned the water. And then what's it talk about, you know, in the you know, the book of Revelation, when John has his revelation on the island of Patmos, right? He talks about how you know, the heavens and the earth will pass away with a terrible noise and fervent heat, how the sky will be rolled up like a scroll, islands and mountains will be removed from their place, and the earth will be destroyed with this fire, right? This great mountain burning will be thrown into the sea. It's called wormwood, which wormwood means like bitter or radioactive, poisonous, basically. Same thing was described in the Colburn Bible, right? When in the Bible it says that everything was turned into blood, right? Everything was turned into blood. And make sure you guys hit the thumbs up for me if you're in the chat, please. It helps with the algorithm. But everything was turned into blood. The waters were turned into blood. A third of the waters were turned into blood, and all of this, right? When this mountain, this wormwood hits the water, this great star that falls from the heavens, you know, it causes this earthquake and all this stuff, right? Then you look at the Colburn Bible, right, which was antediluvian, pre-flood, written on brass, you know, which is very symbolic, because brass is like a type of alloy that comes from copper as well. So whenever we hear like the brass age or the first age, and then the blue bloods, which had the copper in their blood, right, all of this kind of connects. It should be all like coming full circle. So then you look at the pre-flood, you know, the waters were turned bitter, they were turned to blood, which become poisonous, you know. And the Bible says there's nothing new under the sun. Nothing new under the sun. Meaning everything, you know, gets a return. It all happens again. So it's like whatever we've seen happen, you know, in the Ancient of Days. And you got to think about it, guys. Like when we look at like the soil records, the geological records here on Earth, this is like the craziest part. You know, there's literally like a layer of soot, you know, across the entire Earth. There is, you know, layers where the entire Earth has been flooded. So there's like actual records, you know, of, you know, worldwide cataclysms taking place that were described in the Bible, you know. And you think about it, the age of Pisces, the age of water. We have the great flood, the deluge, right? The age of Aries and the age of Ram, the age of the ram, right? We had the fire and all of that. It's like, you know, in Sodom and Gomorrah, and, you know, we're having all these things be described. And even if you want to take it, you know, a little bit back, a lot of people say there was no such thing as dinosaurs. Well, what were dinosaurs actually? You know, they were dragons. They were reptiles. They were serpents. And now they're even saying that some of these dinosaurs actually had feathers. And what were the gods being described as? Feathered serpents, right? Feathered serpents, you know. And what were they taken out by? A giant asteroid, right? The Chicks Club or whatever it is. I'm sure I said that very wrong, but you see what I'm saying, you know. Like there's literally a record for everything, including transfiguration. So when Christ talks about how in the twinkling of an eye, when we see him, we will be like him. I want you to think about this. See, radiation causes DNA to mutate, right? So when the sun goes through these cycles, these solar cycles, and the solar cycles are actually what also coincide with these cataclysmic cycles, right? So literally, you know, and I don't know if it's triggered by a binary twin of our sun. They say that 50% of the star systems in the galaxy are binary systems. It's actually the most common, within the universe is a binary. The most common star is a red dwarf star, right? So for them to believe, and in all of these, mythos, and I believe mythology, the way that mythology works is pretty wild because it's like, for one, it is a historical in accounting, right? A lot of them are historically, accounts of historical things that happenings of historical. But then it's also, which is what makes it kind of transcend, what we really can understand, because it's also got this this metaphysical aspect to it that speaks to the unconscious mind, and it's like the collective story of humanity as well. Every time you read one of these mythos or mythologies, it's like the hero's journey and all of this. It's it has the ability to activate this soul awakening within us as well, which I think is amazing. I do. It really just kind of shows you that whether it was our ancestors or it was the fallen, whatever, the same way that God wrote his name on everything, and we see this golden ratio or this Fibonacci sequence on every bit of creation, right? Kind of like the signature of God on everything. The stories of the Bible, the story of Christ, the story of humanity is written in the stars. It's written in the topography, of the land. It's written in the soil through the, it's written in our genetics. It's written through our organs, our anatomy. I mean, and then these mythos, these mythologies, it's written in that as well, and it's like everything really does tie together, everything does tie together, and it really makes you wonder as well too, if this isn't something divine per se, right? These stories, these mythologies, it kind of makes you wonder, like, what type of technology they were, and how advanced were these beings if they had the ability, because it was said that the Anunnaki were able to, they created through the word, through the logos, right? They were on a whole nother level, with what they were able to do. And this is according to, Sumerian and Akkadian texts and all this. They created through word, right? Through the logos. And you think about things. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, right? Christ is the Word, right? And without words, without the ability of language, it's like we wouldn't even be conscious. You know what I mean? Like, without the ability of language, it's like we wouldn't be able, consciousness to me is the ability to communicate with oneself. It's like I can think to me, I can talk to me, right? Because of language, and like I said, through the characters, which are letters and pictograms and symbols and all of that, which have the ability to represent, energetic frequencies and archetypes and all of this. That is an expression of language, So, it literally is, the word, and word is vibration, and sound, sound has the ability to shape and mold matter and move and manipulate energy. Whenever we're, say we're casting spells, we're doing it or prayers even, right? God said that our tongues have the power of life and death in them. They have the power to bless and to curse, because it's the vibration, that you're speaking out when you're calling to God. What are you saying? How do they say, how you can tell if somebody is a follower of God or not, right? Who do you say is the Christ, right? Who do you say is the Messiah, right? That is supposed to be the litmus test, according to the Bible, on whether someone, is a follower of God or not, right? Is by who they say is the Messiah, who they claim the Christ to be, right? Why? Because it's that word, it's that vibration, right, of Jesus, Yeshua, right? Yeshua, it's a vibration. And remember, Jesus is synonymous, with he's the second Adam, or the last Adam. He's also, he's the next Moses. Moses, it was like and that's why after Moses, Joshua came, right? Like, which is Yeshua, right? Joshua. It's all the same. Like, we see this repetitious, these patterns, these unconscious, rhythms, these waves, these vibrations that seem to echo throughout time and cycle throughout time, and that rhythm, is that wave of consciousness is us in essence, and I believe we are dealing, these fallen, they are entities that have the ability, they're interdimensional, and I believe we were at one point in time, and we still are, interdimensional beings, interdimensional entities. We still are, but we're only conscious, of us, our inhabitants in the physical realm or dimension, right? We're only conscious of this space that we're inhabiting, which sucks. It sucks. Because in a lot of, metaphysics and the occult, is training you how to focus, your energy into another dimension or another realm or another space. And essentially that's, what witchcraft is the ability to, manipulate that, and bend it to your will, and that's why Aleister Crowley says, do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. Why? Why would it be do what thou wilt, right? The Bible says thy will be done, right? But Crowley says do what thou wilt. It's because, in that concept, you're placing yourself on the throne of God, right? It's like you're saying, I am my own God, which, takes you back to the whole concept of Satanism, right? Being your own God, right? Which is Satanism. And then the deistic Satanism, which is recognizing Satan or that demiurge as the god of this world and recognizing that we are all subservient to that. And in order to have our riches and the things that we desire in this realm, right, where we're making sacrifices and giving offerings, to make that energetic trade, And I got into this a little earlier, but I didn't talk about it a whole lot. That's, the whole E equals MC squared and all this, right? And this transference of energy and this balancing, in essence of the scales, right? Because, we have this destiny, we have this purpose that we were born with. And when we're trying to alter that and we want to be famous, we want to be wealthy, we want to meet, be with a certain person and all of this, right? Whenever we want to alter things and manipulate them in a selfish, self-serving way, right? Then, that's not in alignment with our path. I mean, I'm not saying that we can't have the things that we desire, but everything takes, it's work in essence. You have to put yourself into alignment to allow those things to come to you, right? So it's like if you're trying to take a shortcut to something, then it's going to cost you. And the greatest cost, that's why abortion is so big, and I don't mean to offend anybody at all. I know a lot of people, when they do things when they're younger, they're not aware of, what they're actually doing, what they're actually participating in. But if you think all the way back to the worship of Baal and the Canaanites and all of this, what were they doing? They were sacrificing little ones, right? People were offering up their little ones, and they were doing that because that's a life, right? It's a life, and the more innocent, it is, the closer it is to God, the more powerful and more potent it is. You got to think, like I said, a lot of these people that are participating in this, these elite families that rule the world, they are the descendants of the fallen, and as a descendant of the fallen, they have no forgiveness, and I'm not talking about just humans that have joined secret societies and, outright sold their soul and stuff like that. I'm talking about those that have that reptilian blue blood in them, right? That, they're the whole incest and all that, they're interbreeding and intermarrying and all of that to keep their bloodlines pure, because they can trace their bloodlines all the way back to the fallen. And that's where these monarchs and all of this stuff, got their claims to their thrones, is because they, it was a claim of divinity, right? That traced back to these fallen. And remember, these fallen, that's the whole punishment, is they came down on earth and they were mating, with women, and they had children, which were the Watchers or the giants, which is Nephilim, which Nephilim actually derives from, I believe it's Aramaic, which is like Nephal or something like that. So it can mean fallen, but it can also mean giants. So it's like, when we think of like the whole concept of a giant, you could also think of a giant too as something consciously, right? Like an energetic giant, a conscious giant, right? It's like got a bigger consciousness, or it's enlightened, And remember, a lot of the stuff that they were doing, these giants were doing, what were they doing? They were devouring man and drinking their blood, and right, they were conquering everything, and they were sinning against the animals. Right, it's the same shit we're doing today. We're sinning against the animals when we drive them to extinction. It's like we're going against the natural balance of the earth. And we're destroying the animals. We're destroying people. It's still the same things. Still the same things. And when I was talking about the Tropic of Capricorn, or with the Sigma star and Canis A and B, or the canines within our mouth, right? And the Canaanites, and the Dogon, and you can see these things like it's continuous. It's continuous, right? All of these different connections, in the ancient world to these same type of beings, and it really makes you begin to understand, because, why there was such a emphasis put on destroying all of their offspring by Old Testament God, right? When he's like, hey, do not leave a single survivor, when you conquer this tribe, it's because they were sacrificing, little ones, right? They were doing atrocities against mankind, and remember, he would tell like King David and stuff, like in the Israelites, when they would conquer some of these tribes, not only do they not leave anybody alive, right? Man, woman, child, don't leave a single survivor. but he said, don't take any spoils from them either. Like, don't take any of their damn idols. Don't take none of their gold, none of their silver, because it was all cursed. It was all used in witchcraft and dark magic and, necromancy, and a lot of people believe that, Necronomicon and all that is just, in movies and, Lovecraft shit, but allegedly they have these books in the Vatican. And if you think about, the Necronomicon, which is the Book of the Dead, that entire book is all about, the Sumerian old ones, the Sumerian old ones, and these giant serpents, the Cthulhu's mythos, right, with Tiamat and Cthulhu's, right, these giant serpents of the universe that did battle, and Marduk and all of this. It's the same thing. And these old ones, which were so terrible you can't even speak the name of. And then you want to go back and look at all these ancient civilizations, and you'll see that there was, and I've talked about this before, that there were different species that appeared, that lived on the earth in different cycles. We had the Greeks had the Olympians, right, on Mount Olympus, like Zeus and all that, which would be, those 7 emissaries, right? Those 7, demigods or deities. The 7 planets, which are described in the Book of Enoch. They're the wandering stars. That's what planet means, right? These 7 burning mountains, or 7 stars that took, various forms and sinned against God and man, right? And procreated with man. But you had the Olympians, and then before that you had the Titans, and and they literally was putting these giant monster. And then before that you had what were they called? It was Gaia, and I think it was it Uranus? I think it was Uranus or Neptune, but they were basically like these, these elementals, they were water and earth, and a lot of them have these same things, primordials is what they were called. Sorry, they were called primordials. So you had primordials, then Titans, then Olympians, and then you look at, Anunnaki, Igigi or Igigi, however you want to say it, then, humans. And this goes on and on and on, every single culture, even the Bible, right? Like, what is it? Elohim, Nephilim, right? Like, so these are the same, it's like describing the same damn things. And a lot of them are broken down, and you can see the destructions based to, that according to the precession of the equinox and the different cycles that were taking place, right? Deluge with water in Pisces, right? Which is the fish, which Jesus, right, represent the fish. The 2 fish represents duality, right? And we live in this dualistic nature, all of it, right? And then before that, Marduk, right? The ram, and the sign of Aries and fire, and and then things were destroyed by fire, before that, Taurus. And then you think of how Prometheus in his tale, he brings the bull, right? He brings the bull to Zeus, because Zeus was pissed off because Prometheus stole the 50 sparks or whatever, from the gods and brought them down and enlightened humanity, right? Which Prometheus would be Lucifer. And because Zeus gets pissed off, and this was the first golden age, which Trump's telling you about the second golden age, right? Which is the Saturnian age, right? It's the Saturnian age. It's a Saturn worship, the black cube worship, all of that. So people that can't see that Trump's controlled opposition, sorry, I can't help you, you know, because that's obvious as shit. You should have learned that back in 2016. But some people, politics is a hard one to shake. It is. Religion is a hard one to shake, and so is politics, because people create their identity out of their political and religious beliefs. So it's like it offends them at a depth that's, you know, they personalize their political and religious beliefs, and they take it on as a part of themselves. So whenever you say something about their religious or political beliefs, they take it as a personal attack, you know, because they personalize it. They take that on as a piece of their identity. But the Taurian age, and then you think about Taurus and its connections to the, you know, Venusian and Venus and all this, right? And remember, Prometheus, which is Lucifer, Venus, the light bearer, Aphrodite, god of love, sacred heart, blah, 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 right? Which before him, right, with the Odin and Mercury and just, I can keep going, right? But, so Venus, right? Prometheus, he steals these 50 sparks, which the 50 stars on the flag, right? We talked about all this earlier. Brings these 50 sparks and illuminates humanity, right? In our golden age. And there was like no sin, no sadness, no nothing, right? Well, Zeus gets pissed, you know? So he brings the bull down and divides it in two piles, right? And one pile was a bigger pile, and it was all the crap, you know? And another pile was a smaller pile, and was all the good stuff, right? And he tells, you know, he tricks Zeus, you know, because remember, he's a trickster also, right? He's not just the bringer of enlightenment, he's also a trickster. You know, Zeus, which would be Jupiter, which would be Thor, which would be Marduk, and remember the tale of these gods, right? Kronos or Saturn, which is Father Time, you know, the Lord of the Rings, right? He's the god of this world, and he has these 5 or 6 sons, right? And the last one is hidden, right? His mom gives him to eat a rock instead, right? And hides him away. And it's Thor, it's Zeus, it's Jupiter, it's Marduk, right? So all these things are talking about the same planets, the same deities, these 7 burning mountains, these 7 gods with the various forms, right? The same Atlanteans that went out in the Emerald Tablets into all the 7 continents, right? Because everything is a reflection, right, of that consciousness, like Jung said. Right, so he shows him these 2 piles, and he's like, you know, which pile, you know, do you want? You know, and of course he knew, because he was so prideful, right? He was a god, that he was going to choose the biggest, right? So he tricked him. He got all the bullshit, literally, right? Because it was a bull. You know, and you think about all the bull worship and all this, right? How when Moses came down from the mountain, Mount Sinai, which all of them came off of mounts, right? You know, Mount Hermon, Mount Olympus, Mount Sinai, right? All of them did. The Mount of Olives, right? I could go on and on. You know, which shows you like all these religions of the world are the same, right? They're just remixes of the same stories, really. Which, you know, that mythos, the mythology, it's embedded there, you know. But anyways, the collective unconscious being projected into all of it. You know, and when he chooses the wrong pile and he figures out he's gotten tricked, you know, that's when he gets punished. You know, he gets punished, and they put him on a piece of wood, you know, or a tree, you know, tack him up on a cross, right? And they have the vulture come and eat his liver over and over. So every day the vulture eats his liver until it's all the way gone, and he suffers and dies over and over and over and over. And the liver is the only organ which regenerates, right? It represents regeneration, you know. And to me, this also is a representation of us, of our cycles, right? For one, you think about our telomeres. It's called the telomere effect, right? How it appears as if, and scientists, geneticists, all of this have discovered this. Like, it appears as if someone has literally artificially soldered the telomeres within our body, right? Telomeres are what allows us to regenerate and what would allow us to be immortal, basically. They have been cut short. It looks like they've been soldered or, cut off by something or someone. They can't explain why they've been shortened. And guess what the extent of them is, right? When God said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, shall not live no more than 120 years. Well, that's because your telomeres won't go any further than that. So you literally can't live no more than 120 years. Maybe a couple people get a couple more years out of it, but that's it. Because remember, people, Methuselah and all these other people were living like 800-900 years and shit. And even when he was talking about in the book of Enoch, how the Nephilim, that he was going to shorten the days of their children, that they wouldn't live 500 years, right? That he would watch them die, right? The fallen would watch them die, and kill each other. And then you look at the story of Prometheus with the liver that's regenerating only to be killed over and over and over. And think about the cycles of humanity. Literally, think about us, guys. Like, it appears as if when we cycle through these ages, through this procession of the equinox and these solar cycles and all of it, these resets, that we ascend to a high level of consciousness. And when we reach that pinnacle of consciousness, for whatever reason, it coincides with these solar cycles. So, it's scientifically proven that the sun and its cycles directly affect our intelligence, our lifespan, all of it, right? So these solar cycles, they increase our intelligence, our consciousness, how long we live, all of it, and then once it peaks, there's, and solar radiation, which is given off during these cycles as, we go into these peaks of the sun and solar activity, has the ability to mutate DNA. Right, which kind of explains why they would want to put chemtrails in the air, right? Because these nanoparticulates have the ability to refract light back out into space and to bend light and to block the radiation. So essentially, it's like they are preventing us from receiving that radiation that, mutates our DNA. So remember when Christ says, in the twinkling of an eye, when they see him, they will be like him. In the twinkling of an eye, they will be transfigured. To me, that's what I think of. I think of this process that takes place at the end of the ages where, the solar cycles shift and we have this, solar maximums and, extreme solar activity with this solar radiation. So it increases consciousness, right? We're more intelligent. We're living longer, and our DNA is being altered, all of this. And I even got, hold on, in the book of Enoch, it even says as much too. Hold on. Yes. So, when he's describing like this wall of fire, right, and the 7 burning mountains and the 7 angels that transgressed against God and all of that, he then talks about what I believe is, maybe it's, our chakras, I don't know, our genetics, but he talks about these 7 mountains, right, 3 to the east and 3 to the south, and then one that's in the seventh one is in the midst of all of them, right? So are these, ages or what? Because we think of like the East, Aries in the East, were these like the time of Marduk, or these ages that were happening? I don't know, right? Are these the seven chakras? I don't know, right? I'm not sure. When it comes to that, we do know a day is like 1,000 years to God or whatever, right? So these 7,000 year cycles, 7 days to create everything. And remember in the book of Genesis, when it says that the earth was void and without shape, what it actually means is like it come from destruction. So that means there was a previous earth in Genesis 2. Just saying, right? There was something that was already created. It means desolate and destroyed, right? When it was formless and void, right? It means it was desolate and destroyed. So that means something was already created. When you think about, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel and all this, how they went to cities after he killed his brother, right? There was people on the earth, guys, is what I'm saying. There was already people around. So it talks about these 7 mountains, right? And that one was in the midst of them. And that the seventh one that was in the midst of, or the center of all of them. And then you think about the churches, the 7 churches and all of this, right? In the book of Revelations as well. 7 trumpets, 7 lampstands, so on and so forth. And that the tree in the center with blooms, it's Christ in essence, right? And that it has this fragrance, that will be, hold on, something, basically the fragrance that will be in their bones, right? So this tree that's in the midst of all of these mountains has a fragrance that will be in the bones of the elect, right? And when I think about that, just like Adam and Eve, when it talks about Eve was made from the rib and how rib comes from DNA and genetics, right? You think about this, tree. My first thought when I thought about this tree was like genetics, right? The tree of life, the tree of good and evil, right? And like, the tree of our genes, right? And the branches, right? Because when it talks about cutting off branches and stuff in the Bible, it's always talking, family trees, right? And that these are like the elect ones, the chosen ones, and the tree is Christ giving off this fragrance, right? That is in the bones of the saints, So, like I was saying, this radiation that it's given off by the sun that has the ability to mutate DNA, and that every time we see one of these catastrophic cycles, every single time, right, when everything gets wiped out on the face of the earth, what happens? Everything on the earth, when it comes back again, it's mutated, right? Look at like dinosaurs to now, right? All the different mutations, right? Look at all the different species and how they've altered over time. Different fish, different animals, right? They've been mutated. And then Christ says, when we see him, we will be like him, right? Be transfigured, meaning we'll transform, we'll be changed, right? In the twinkling of an eye, and it's talking about the fragrance from this tree that's in the midst of all of them, this tree that's Christ, and that it will transform us, and it's in our bones, right? You just think about it, and it's like, damn, damn. Literally within us, it's activated, in this final time, and this sweet fragrance, in this tree that is being prepared for us. It is so we will never, hunger or thirst, so we will never suffer or sadness, right? It's like this evolution, of us is what it sounds like. At least in my opinion, that's what it sounds like. It's, and just to kind of put a little bow on it, when it talks about this great burning mountain, and like this river of fire and all this, like this wall of fire that's coming off of it. Remember, it talks about the hollow rock that holds the souls. I said that I believe that's the moon, and it's got these chambers that are holding souls, until the day of judgment, It talks about the wandering stars, which are the 7 angels that change many forms, transgress against God, and mated with men. And then it talks about this burning rock. And remember, in the book of Revelation, there's a burning mountain that's thrown into the sea. I talked about the Colburn Bible, which is pre-diluvian, and the destroyer, which is, a burning mountain, the destroyer that's also thrown into the sea, right? And then you think about Nibiru, Marduk, right? The destroyer of worlds, right? And remember, on the great and terrible day of the Lord, right? Fire and brimstone, Sodom and Gomorrah, the destruction of the dinosaurs, and dinosaurs, that terrible lizard, and we think about reptilians and how the seraphim, these seraphic entities, right? That's what they were, these plumed and feathered serpents. And now they're discovering that dinosaurs, a lot of them actually had feathers, and we find their bones all over the earth. And it was an extinction event in fire, I'm just saying, like, maybe there's more evidence. And, and dinosaurs were also called dragons as well, in the ancient times, We see a lot of this stuff, guys, down to it. I feel like the evidence, and like I was saying about the Romans and the I-900, and, the I being transformed into one, and the adding of 1,000 years when they switched to the Gregorian calendar and all of this. When you truly think about it, maybe they did that because we're so much closer to the ancient past than we even can imagine, right? Maybe it's like, and this is one of the things that really, like, blows my mind. I believe there was a reset around the mid 1700s, actually. That's, and you look at, like, the story of, like, World War I, World War II, not Chelyabinsk, what is the other meteor that hit in Russia? Damn it, the name's slipping, but it was a big ass meteor that exploded. And the toroid meteors and all of that, when they pass, and then the Spanish flu, and then you see, like, in our period of time, COVID and all of this. It's like the same story just repeats over and over and over again. Remember, there's nothing new under the sun, and it's like the modern world with the combustion engine and all of these things. Like, we think we're like the pinnacle of humanity, and raised to such a high point of civilization, but it's like, have we really? We think that we're more intelligent than any other period of time, any other point of humanity, right? Like, but I believe we're actually probably the dumbest version of us that's been around, if you truly think about it. But it does, and when it talks about the time of tribulation, the time of tribulation, that knowledge will increase, right? So it's like, that's how you know. And I want you to, like, look around the world, look around at how many people are, like, waking up now. How all of the information, is right at the tip of our fingers, just right there for all of us to see, all of us to experience, all of us to know. 50 years ago, I got a fucking device in my hand. I can literally get the coordinates to any building, the answer to any history, like, just in the blink of an eye, at my fingertips. So there is this time of this increased knowledge, and remember, when the disciples asked Christ, when would be these last days, right? The end, when that would happen. It's like, when you see the man carrying the pail of water, which is the age of Aquarius. And according to the Mayan calendar and their Baktunes, right, that shift is 2012, and I believe 2030 is when the shift is complete, So, you think about, solar cycle 25 and all the different things that we're experiencing now. And it's like, we're damn close, and like year 2020. And here's what I was going to say too about this mountain of fire and this wall of fire and all this that was seen in the heavens, right? With Nibiru, right? Nibiru is depicted as this planet with wings, And like I said, Nibiru in the ancient Babylonian means Jupiter. Enuma Elish, it's Jupiter, right? So which Jupiter is the king planet. Jupiter is also Marduk, right? Right? Which would be that firstborn son, and according to that prophecy, that was Enki's firstborn son who ascended to the heavens, all of this, right? And he's the king planet, of those 7 gods. And he's also got an all-seeing eye, by the way, right? He's got Jupiter's red eye on there. Just saying, But anyways, basically, the Nibiru thing, this red striped planet with wings, what many people believe is the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, right? And that's when every time these ages end, and I believe the last one was like around 400 years ago in the 1700s, when I said I believe that was like a soft reset, but I do believe a reset took place then. It's called Book of Miracles, right? And it's this amalgamation of all these different paintings and newspapers and stuff from Germany and all over the world that show basically a lot of crazy celestial shit and UFOs and all types of weird stuff, back, late 16, early 1700s at that time, before horsemen and all kinds of stuff in the air. It's just weird stuff. Multiple suns, just very crazy, crazy stuff. And then the one before that was like 800 years ago. So like and the one 400 years ago wasn't even like a precise one. It was like a half-assed Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. But we had one December 21st, 2020, which is the solstice, and we know the significance of the solstice, and in religions and paganism and hell, that's where Christmas comes from. It's winter solstice. But it was on the solstice in 2020. 2020 being that the year of clear view and all of this. You just think about it and what it actually is. And remember, Constantine, when he switched to Christianity, what did he see? He seen the cross and the sky. What did he actually see? What did he actually see? The crossing. What is Nibiru? It's the transition planet, or the planet of the crossing, right? So what is crossing is Jupiter crosses in front of Saturn. Remember Saturn, the Lord of the Rings, Kronos, Father Time. He's got the hexagon on the North Pole, which is the cube, right? And the Masonic cube is, the 1 + 5, 1 + 5, 666, right? And that's where we get, he's also got the all-seeing eye on the South Pole, right? And he's Father Time, right? That's where 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and then 24 hours, 2 + 4 is 6. And then think about the spin of the earth and all of that. It all equals 666, right? All of it. And that's the whole soul system or solar system, right? Saturn, Satan, God of the world, right? The All-Father, right? And then his oldest son, right? The Thor, Zeus, Marduk, Jupiter, right? The one who usurps him, right? That's when he usurps him. That's when he usurps him. Is the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. It's when Jupiter literally comes in front of Saturn, right? They have an alignment, and it looks like Jupiter has wings because of the rings of Saturn behind it. And that's where they get the whole planet Nibiru thing from. You know, Nibiru in ancient Babylonia was Jupiter, right? Enuma Elish was Jupiter, and Marduk is Jupiter. Like, it takes everything like full circle when you really think about it, is what I'm saying. And that marks the end of the age. When those things come around, when that Saturn-Jupiter conjunction comes around, it's the planet of the crossing or the transition planet. So when Constantine seen the cross in the sky, what he actually seen was the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, I believe, right? Which signified the end of the age. So he switched his religion to the Piscean age, which was Christianity, because they were going into the age of water, right? Through the precession of the equinox. Now, the end of the Bach tunes and all that, as we go into 2030, right? The age of Aquarius. And Christ said that would be, the end of the age. When you see the man carrying the pail of water, follow him into his house, right? Follow him into to his celestial house, right? So it's like we're all experiencing this, together. And I know it's wild. And I know it seems like really out there for a lot of people, and it's probably a lot to ingest. Great show. Well, thank you, John. I appreciate that, brother. Thank you. And I know it's a whole lot for, people to ingest in one video. For real, it is. But I mean, it's something for people to consider. See, it's like, a lot of people, and I hate to say this, man, but it's like it's so oversaturated. Like, content is now, it's so oversaturated. I've been doing content creation for fucking almost a decade now. Matter of fact, I just had, I just started TikTok again not too long ago. I got 1 million views on a video, hit 10,000 followers. They deleted that account. And I'm like, fuck it, I'll start another account. They deleted that one today. So, I've had so many YouTube channels deleted, Facebook accounts deleted. So it's just, it's crazy. It's crazy, because if you're really saying truth, then it's going to be offensive, it's going to be offensive. And the truth is threatening because the truth sets you free, dude. Literally. And you know what? It doesn't set you free because I'm anything special. I ain't shit, right? But it sets you free because it empowers you. It's like none of the lies can work on you anymore. Like I was saying, how hard it is for people to overcome like the political and religious paradigm. It breaks the shackles right off of you. Religion no longer has a hold. It's like the truth and you can sift through all of it. It's like, and you really know, and at the end of the day, the only true book, it truly is the Bible. It's like that's the only one that I feel like is, without flaws, honestly. And I've obviously read a lot of texts, a lot of books, and I've done a lot of videos on all of them on this channel at least, and on many others, and yet, at the end of the day, it's like, God says, remember your first love, right? And it like takes me back to the most simplest truth. The first thing I learned, the first thing that brought me into all of this, which it was the Bible. It was Christ, and like at the end of the day, I've gotten myself mixed up in cults and, witchcraft, black magic, Satan worship, all kinds of fucking weird shit over the years, and at the end of the day, it's like, it's like come back full circle. And it reminds me of like this verse that says, if it were possible, they would deceive even the very elect, right? I mean, it's like we may stray off the path, but it's not possible, to deceive the elect. It's not possible. And it's like God's name is written on us, and it's like written on our hearts, and it's like, and like I said, the book of Enoch says, using our heart understanding comes through the heart. It's like it's written on our hearts. It's like, you know, and like I said in Hosea, you know, God describes, you know, when we break his heart, it's like the pain a man feels when his wife cheats on him. You know, literally that kind of pain. You know, because we are literally doing that. We're cheating on him with another God. You know, we're choosing whether we know it or not. You know, and you can be an atheist, it doesn't matter. You're still worshiping something, whether you know it or not. You know, we can't help it. Just like a fish's nature is to swim, right? A tiger's nature is to hunt and to prowl and to be a predator. An ant, you know, builds hills and, you know, all of this shit together. And bees are in hives, and, you know, our nature is in the spirit, and we cannot avoid that. We can try to pretend. We can forget it. We can be focused purely on the physical and be totally unaware of it, but we can't avoid it. It is in our essence. It's in our being. It's who we are. It's how we operate, you know? And everything in our reality comes from the spiritual first, you know? And everything from our reality not only comes from the spiritual first, everything is operating in the spirit, whether we see it or not, whether we're aware of it or not. And everything has a spirit behind it. So, you know, I just want you to understand that no matter what choices you're making, you're choosing the spirit. So make sure you're choosing the right one, you know? And I know your heart will guide you on what spirit is what, you know, and what is truth and what isn't. You know, so many people watch content and videos for entertainment, and that's cool. I like entertaining stuff too. I watch all types of UFO shit, and it's really for entertainment because I know ultimately that most of the UFOs we see are, you know, ARVs or replica vehicles, you know, and the government uses all that UFO nonsense because it's, you know, black projects, and that's where a lot of the missing money and all that goes, and that's a whole nother video. You know, but some of these things we're seeing are interdimensional things, and these are celestial entities, you know. And a lot of what we see, the technology, you know, whether it's, you know, people using DMT or whatever, you know, there is this electrochemical aspect to things that we don't fully grasp or understand. You know, and when they talk about the machine elves and clockwork elves and all this shit, when they go into these alternate realities and altered states of consciousness, you better fucking believe there really is something there. You know, it's the windows of perception are allowing you to experience it and see it in a way that you had blinders on before. Remember, you can only see 0.00001% of the electromagnetic light spectrum with your physical eyes. You can only access 10% of your brain at any given time. You know, you can't see ultraviolet, you can't see infrared, you can't see shit. You know, and you can't hear shit. A dog can hear more than you. You know, and you wonder why animals react to ghosts and spirits and stuff you can't see. I believe the animals of the earth are far more tapped in. That's why birds and stuff are tapped into the magnetic field and know when it's time to migrate. It's all the flow of energy. And we are the ones that have been altered. We are the ones that have fallen in consciousness. We are the ones, right, that have been pulled away from our essence and all of that and aren't tuned in. And I feel like the animals, you know, they know what we once were like, and they know that we lost it. You know, and it's like, that's why they warn us, you know, when storms are coming. They warn us when there's someone trying to break in our home, you know. It's like illegal and shit for, like, you know, you to give birth with dolphins and all kinds of shit. Like, you know, they create all these things with whales, you know. It's like we have special beings on this planet, you know. It's like we're the ones that have fallen out of tune. But I think we're coming back into tune. You know, I really believe we're at a amazing time, amazing time, and this is one of the most exciting times to be alive ever. You know, if not ever. You hear every holy book, every, you know, the Bible, it talks about in those days, the days of tribulation, the days of great change, right? Like this is it. If you were ever to be incarnated at any time ever, you are in the prime time spot. You know, this is Monday Night Football of humanity. You know, really is. So you gotta love it. But I think I'm gonna wrap it up here. I do appreciate each and every one of you. If you would like to donate and support my channel, it's paypal.me, the Best Damn Podcast, Cash App, Best Damn Podcast, Patreon, Best Damn Podcast Official, or Facebook Messenger Pay, and it's John Keene, Best Damn Podcast. Follow me, Facebook, Best Damn Podcast, Twitter, The Real Best Damn, Instagram, Best Damn Podcast. I'm not sure. I just started a brand new TikTok today. I don't know why the platform's just trash and they just keep booting me. I mean, I've had so many accounts deleted on that. I just, you know, I can't win for losing. And I've had such a rough go of things lately. My baby mama lost her place to live, is in the shelter with my kids. I've just had a lot of stuff personally, man. A lot of stuff personally in my life to worry about and stress about, you know, family and just all kinds of stuff. So it's been, I appreciate each and every, all you guys that reach out to me and text me and message me and all you guys that support me and help me and just all of it. But I love all you guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. If you're watching this on Facebook or wherever you catch this from, please share it, get it out there. Like, thumbs up, comment. It helps with the algorithms, and consider donating and supporting. Love you guys. See you next time. Peace.